Hey there, I'm Carl. I've been a local newspaper columnist in this city for over 30 years, and trust me, I've seen my fair share of stories that make you question everything. From feel-good tales that restore your faith in humanity to shocking moments that leave you shaking your head in disbelief, my job has been to tell it all. But every now and then, a story lands in my lap that's so jaw-dropping, so utterly outrageous, that it stays with you long after the ink dries on the page. This one's a real humdinger. It's about a couple of racist cops who pulled over a black woman for no reason. Just your average Tuesday night traffic stop, right? Wrong. Because when her husband showed up, let's just say the tables turned so fast, the cops didn't know what hit him. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let me take you to the moment it all went down. Picture this: two officers standing on the side of a quiet road, smug as can be, thinking they've got all the power. But the man who showed up wasn't just anyone. No, sir. He was someone who could bring their entire world crashing down in an instant. And when he pulled out that badge, you could practically see the color drain from their faces. But hold on, let's rewind a little. Let me take you back to how it all started. It was a cool Tuesday night, the kind of night where the streets are empty except for the occasional headlights of a passing car. Alicia Johnson, a hard-working mom of two, was driving home from her late-night shift at the marketing firm she'd worked at for years. She was tired but content, sipping on the chai latte she'd just grabbed from a gas station near the freeway. The road stretched long and lonely ahead of her, the only sounds the low hum of her engine and the faint tunes of Marvin Gaye playing softly from the car's speakers. Alicia had driven this route 1,000 times before, so when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, her first thought was confusion. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run any stop signs. So why were the police pulling her over? With a deep sigh, she signaled and pulled to the side of the road. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her license and registration. Years of stories about traffic stops gone wrong flooded her mind, but she shook them off, reminding herself to stay calm. The officer who approached her window was tall and lean, with a face that seemed carved out of stone. "License and registration," he barked, shining his flashlight directly into her eyes. Alicia handed over the documents without a word, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No problem," he replied, though the way his lips curled into a smug smile made it clear he didn't mean it. "Just a routine check. You know, keeping the streets safe." The second officer, shorter and stockier, approached the passenger side of her car, circling it like a shark. Alicia felt her stomach tighten as she noticed the way his eyes scanned her, as if looking for a reason to escalate the situation. "Step out of the car, ma'am," the taller officer ordered. Alicia hesitated. "Why do I need to step out? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's smile disappeared. His voice turned sharp, cold. "I said, step out of the car." Her mind raced. She'd seen how these situations could spiral out of control. But she also knew her rights. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'd like to know why I'm being asked to step out of the car." The taller cop leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You're refusing to comply?" Alicia's hands tightened on the steering wheel as fear clawed at her chest. She was about to speak when, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed another set of headlights approaching. A black SUV pulled up behind the police cruiser, and the driver's door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his suit sharp, his expression unreadable. And just like that, the mood shifted. The officers turned toward him, their smug confidence flickering for the first time. "Can we help you, sir?" the taller one asked, though his voice wasn't nearly as commanding as it had been with Alicia. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he calmly walked up to the scene, his presence alone demanding attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "That's my wife you've got here. Mind telling me what this is all about?" The cops exchanged a glance, their unease palpable. "Just a routine stop," the shorter officer muttered. "Routine?" The man raised an eyebrow and pulled something from his pocket. A badge. Not just any badge, one that carried weight, authority. The kind of badge that made men like these cops squirm. "I suggest you explain yourselves," he said, his tone cool as ice. And that's when the taller officer's face went white. Alicia Johnson hadn't planned for her night to end like this. All she wanted was to get home, slip into her cozy pajamas, and maybe watch an episode or two of her favorite show before calling it a night. But now, she found herself standing on the side of the road, face to face with two police officers who seemed hellbent on making her their target. Rewind a couple of hours, and it had been a pretty normal evening. Work had been hectic as usual, with last-minute reports and client calls piling up. By the time Alicia finally left the office, it was well past 9. She'd stopped by the gas station for her usual chai latte, a small treat she always looked forward to after a long day, and then hit the road for the 25-minute drive home. As the empty stretch of highway stretched out in front of her, she let the familiar rhythm of her commute soothe her nerves. She was singing along softly to "Let's Get It On" when those dreaded flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her initial reaction had been confusion. Maybe they'd mistaken her for someone else? But as she pulled over and saw the officers approach, she felt the all-too-familiar wave of anxiety wash over her. She'd heard enough stories, lived through enough of them, to know this could go sideways in an instant. Still, she reminded herself to keep her composure. Hands visible, no sudden movements, polite but firm. That was the advice her parents had drilled into her since she was a teenager. "You don't get the luxury of messing up," her father used to say. "Do everything right, so if something goes wrong, it's on them, not you." She followed the script perfectly. License, registration, polite tone. But even then, the officers weren't satisfied. The taller one, his name tag read Officer Graham, seemed to be looking for an excuse to escalate. The shorter one, Officer Mills, circled her car, his flashlight scanning every inch as if expecting to find something incriminating. "Ma'am, I'll say it again. Step out of the vehicle," Graham ordered, his voice sharper this time. Alicia's heart raced as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The night air was cool against her skin, but it did nothing to ease the heat of the moment. She stood there, hands by her sides, as Graham and Mills closed in, their flashlights bouncing off her face. "What's the issue here, officers?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We're just doing our job," Mills replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "Making sure everything checks out." Alicia wanted to scream. Making sure everything checks out? What did that even mean? She was a law-abiding citizen, driving home from work. There was nothing to check out. But she bit her tongue, knowing that anger wouldn't get her anywhere with men like these. And then, as if the universe decided to add insult to injury, Graham asked, "This your car?" That was the moment Alicia felt her patience snap. She took a deep breath, her jaw tightening as she replied, "Yes, this is my car. Is there a problem with that?" Graham raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to push back. "Just making sure," he said, though the smirk on his face told her exactly what he was implying. The tension was thick, and Alicia felt like a string about to snap. She was about to say something when the sound of another car approaching caught everyone's attention. The black SUV rolled to a stop behind the police cruiser, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Alicia squinted, trying to make out who it was. She didn't have to wonder for long. The driver's door opened, and out stepped her husband, David. David wasn't a particularly imposing man in stature. He stood just under 6 feet, but his presence was undeniable. He moved with the kind of confidence that made people stop and take notice. Tonight, he was still in his work clothes, a crisp navy suit that made him look every bit the professional he was. The moment the officers saw him, their expressions shifted. They had no idea who he was yet, but they could sense that this wasn't just some random guy coming to check on his wife. David walked up calmly, his eyes scanning the scene. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice low and steady. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Graham, who had been brimming with authority just moments ago, suddenly looked less sure of himself. "Just a routine traffic stop," he said quickly. David's eyes narrowed. "Routine? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've pulled my wife out of her car for no reason. Is there something she did wrong?" Before Graham could answer, David reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open to reveal his badge, its golden surface glinting under the streetlights. And that's when the color drained from their faces. "Let me introduce myself," David said, his tone sharp as a blade. "Special Agent David Johnson. Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence was deafening. Mills took a step back, his hand instinctively moving to his belt, though he quickly stopped himself. Graham stammered, "As Special Agent?" "That's right," David said, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Now I'm going to ask you again, what's going on here?" The look on Officer Graham's face was priceless. You could practically hear the gears in his head grinding to figure out a way out of the mess he just landed himself in. Mills, the stockier one, looked like he wanted to shrink into his uniform and disappear altogether. But David wasn't about to let them off the hook, not after what they'd put Alicia through. "You're telling me this was a routine stop," David said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "And yet, you've got my wife standing out here on the side of the road like she's some kind of criminal. What exactly were you looking for, officers?" Graham cleared his throat, clearly scrambling for an answer. Well, sir, we were conducting a safety check. We're just trying to make sure everything's in order. You understand how it is." David's expression didn't waver. He took a step closer, his badge still in hand. "Oh, I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is why a safety check required her to step out of her car, or why you felt the need to circle her vehicle like a vulture. And while we're at it, what was the problem with her car that made you ask if it was hers?" That last question hit hard. Mills shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the ground. Graham opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I'm waiting," David said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. We didn't mean any disrespect," Mills finally muttered, his eyes still fixed on the pavement. "No disrespect?" David repeated, his tone incredulous. "You didn't mean any disrespect? You pulled over a black woman driving home from work, gave her a hard time for no reason, and now you're trying to play it off as a misunderstanding? Let me tell you something. I've seen men like you ruin lives with your so-called routine stops. So don't stand here and insult my intelligence." Alicia watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. She'd seen David stand up for her before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. This was about every time someone like her had been targeted, humiliated, or made to feel less than. Graham, realizing he was in over his head, tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Sir, we were just following protocol. If we've caused any inconvenience, we apologize." "Inconvenience?" David's voice rose slightly, and both officers flinched. "This isn't about inconvenience. This is about abuse of power. You think you can stop people like my wife because you assume they don't have anyone looking out for them. Well, guess what? You assumed wrong." The officers were silent, their discomfort palpable. But just when it seemed like David might let them off with a warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You see, I believe in accountability," David said as he started dialing. "And since you two seem to have trouble with that concept, I think it's time we bring in someone who can help you understand it." "Wait a minute," Graham said, holding up his hands. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. There's no need to escalate things." "Oh, I'm not escalating anything," David interrupted. "I'm simply reporting misconduct. I'm sure your supervisor will be very interested to hear about this little incident." The mention of a supervisor sent both officers into full panic mode. Mills stepped forward, his hands out in a gesture of surrender. "Look, sir, there's no need to involve anyone else. We're sorry for the misunderstanding. It won't happen again." David's eyes narrowed. "No, it won't. Because if I have anything to say about it, neither of you will be in a position to make this mistake again." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then, just as David pressed the call button, another set of headlights appeared in the distance. A black sedan pulled up, and a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform stepped out. His badge gleamed under the streetlights, and the way he carried himself made it clear he was someone important. The man glanced around, taking in the scene before locking eyes with David. "Agent Johnson," the man said, his tone a mix of respect and curiosity. "What's going on here?" David turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Captain, glad you could join us. I think you'll want to hear this." The captain frowned, his gaze shifting to Graham and Mills. "Officers," he said sharply, "is there something you need to tell me?" The two men froze, their faces pale as ghosts. Whatever they had planned to say, it was too late now. The captain wasn't the kind of man who tolerated excuses. David gestured toward Alicia, his voice steady as he said, "They stopped my wife for no reason. Pulled her out of her car. Treated her like a suspect. And now, they're trying to sweep it under the rug." The captain's eyes darkened, and he turned back to the officers. "Is that true?" Graham stammered, "We didn't mean." "I didn't ask what you meant," the captain snapped. "I asked if it's true." The captain's icy glare cut through the tension like a knife. Graham and Mills stood frozen, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to summon some magical excuse to save themselves. But the captain wasn't a man who tolerated nonsense, and his patience was running thin. "Officers," the captain said, his voice firm and commanding, This is your last chance. I want the truth, and I want it now. What exactly happened here? Graham took a shaky breath, his confidence completely shattered. We pulled her over for a routine check, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. David, who had been standing silently up to this point, let out a sharp laugh. Routine check? That's the best you've got? Captain, they had her standing on the side of the road like a criminal. They asked if the car was hers, as if it's impossible for a black woman to drive something decent. And they only stopped her because they thought they could get away with it. The captain's jaw tightened. He turned back to the officers, his gaze cutting through them like a laser. Is that true? Neither officer responded, but their silence was answer enough. The captain shook his head, his disappointment evident. Unbelievable. You two have no idea how much damage you've just done. Not just to her, but to this department, to the trust we're supposed to uphold. Alicia, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But it's going to be the last time I let it slide. The captain looked at her, his expression softening slightly. Ma'am, I promise you, this will be dealt with. These officers will face consequences. David, still holding his badge, stepped forward. With all due respect, Captain, I'm not just going to take your word for it. I'm filing a formal complaint. This isn't just misconduct, it's systemic abuse, and it has to stop. The captain nodded. I understand. And I'll make sure it's handled at the highest level. You have my word. But before anyone could respond, another car pulled up, a sleek black sedan with government plates. David's sharp gaze flicked toward it, his expression unreadable. The driver stepped out, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. He adjusted his tie as he approached, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. Agent Johnson, the man said, his tone calm but authoritative. I got your call. What's the situation? David's lips tightened into a thin line. Director Morgan, you're going to want to hear this. The mere mention of the director's title sent a ripple of tension through the group. Graham and Mills looked like they might faint. The captain straightened his posture, his demeanor shifting as he realized who had just arrived. Morgan glanced at Alicia, then back at David. Start from the top, he said simply. David didn't hesitate. He recounted every detail, from the moment Alicia was pulled over to the moment he arrived on the scene. He didn't sugarcoat a single thing, and by the time he finished, Morgan's expression was stone cold. Officers, Morgan said, his voice low and controlled, step forward. Graham and Mills hesitated, but a sharp look from the captain made them comply. Morgan studied them for a moment, his gaze unflinching. You know who I am, don't you? He asked. Yes, sir, Graham stammered. Good, Morgan replied. Then you know I have zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. You've not only disgraced your department, but you've also jeopardized public trust. Effective immediately, you're both suspended pending an internal investigation. Turn in your badges and weapons to the captain. The officer's eyes widened in shock. Sir, please, we didn't mean. I don't care what you meant, Morgan interrupted. What you did was unacceptable, and you're going to answer for it. As the officers reluctantly handed over their badges, Alicia felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. David stepped closer to Morgan. Thank you for stepping in, he said. But this isn't just about these two. This is about a system that allows this kind of thing to happen in the first place. Morgan nodded, his expression somber. You're right. And I promise you, this won't end here. But just as the situation seemed to be settling down, a new set of headlights appeared in the distance. The car slowed as it approached, and when it stopped, the passenger door opened. A man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He wore a uniform, but it wasn't the local police, or even the FBI. Agent Johnson, the man called out, his voice unfamiliar. I think you and I need to have a conversation. David's eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you? The man stepped forward, his face now visible under the harsh streetlights. I'm someone who's been watching the situation very closely, he said, a cryptic smile playing on his lips. And just like that, the night took another unexpected turn. Who was this man? And what did he want? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. David squared his shoulders as he studied the man approaching. He didn't recognize him, but the confidence in the man's stride and the insignia on his uniform suggested someone with authority, And possibly an agenda. Agent Johnson, the man repeated, stopping just short of the group. His gaze flicked briefly to Alicia, then to the captain, before settling back on David. Special Agent Marcus Hill, Department of Justice. David's jaw tightened. The DOJ's sudden involvement sent a ripple of unease through him. This wasn't standard protocol. For them to show up here now meant something bigger was at play. What's the DOJ doing here? David asked, his tone guarded. Hill smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Let's just say this incident flagged some concerns at higher levels. Concerns that require immediate attention. Concerns. David echoed, his eyes narrowing. Care to elaborate? Hill took a step closer, lowering his voice as if to ensure only David could hear. You and I both know this isn't an isolated case. These so-called routine stops happen far too often, and they don't always end as peacefully as this one. Someone upstairs thinks it's time we start asking why. David's eyes flicked to Alicia, who was watching the exchange closely. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told him she was just as confused and wary as he was. And what does that have to do with me? David asked, crossing his arms. Hill's smile widened, but it still didn't reach his eyes. You're in a unique position, Agent Johnson. You've got first-hand experience, and you've clearly got no problem speaking out about systemic issues. We think you could be a valuable ally in what's about to come next. David's stomach churned. He didn't like the sound of this, especially not the way Hill phrased it, like there was some unspoken game being played and David was just a piece on the board. And what exactly is about to come next? Hill glanced at the captain and the suspended officers, his expression unreadable. An investigation. A big one. We're not just looking at these two, he said, nodding toward Graham and Mills, but at the entire department. Patterns, practices, leadership, it's all on the table. And when we're done, the fallout could be significant. The captain stiffened. Agent Hill, with all due respect, this department has served this community for decades. We're not perfect, but we don't need the DOJ turning this into a witch hunt. Hill's gaze snapped to the captain, sharp and unyielding. This isn't a witch hunt, Captain. It's accountability. And from where I'm standing, it's long overdue. David watched the exchange in silence, his mind racing. He wasn't naive. He knew how deep the roots of systemic racism ran, and he knew how resistant institutions like this one could be to change. But he also knew that change wouldn't come without a fight. I'll cooperate, David said finally, his voice firm. If this investigation is real and it's about holding people accountable, I'm in. Hill nodded approvingly. Good. We'll be in touch soon. He turned to Alicia, his expression softening slightly. Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry for what you went through tonight. You deserve better than this. Alicia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I've heard that before, she said quietly. Hill didn't respond, but his expression darkened briefly before he turned back to David. One more thing, he said. This investigation? It's going to make waves. And when that happens, you'd better be ready for the blowback. David's gaze didn't waver. I'm always ready. Hill smiled faintly, then turned and walked back to his car. The silence he left behind was almost deafening. The captain cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Agent Johnson, I can assure you will be cooperating fully with the DOJ's investigation. This department has nothing to hide. David gave him a long, hard look. For your sake, I hope that's true. With that, he turned to Alicia and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let's get you home, he said softly. As they walked back to their car, Alicia finally let out a shaky breath. What just happened back there? She asked. David shook his head. I'm not entirely sure. But whatever it is, it's bigger than just us. Alicia frowned, her mind still racing. Do you trust him? That DOJ guy. David hesitated before answering. I don't trust anyone who shows up uninvited. But if they're serious about exposing the truth, I'll make sure they do it right. As they drove away, the flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance. But David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The DOJ's involvement, the cryptic warnings, it all pointed to something bigger, something that could shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. And as for those officers? Well, their reckoning was coming, but so was his. Because once the truth started coming to light, there was no telling who it would take down. But what exactly was Hill playing at? The ride home was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet Alicia usually cherished after a long day. It was heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts. David drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his lap, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. Alicia could tell his mind was running a mile a minute. "Are you really going to work with them?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. David sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "Do I have a choice? If the DOJ is stepping in, that means they've been keeping tabs for a while. And if what Hill said is true, this isn't just about those two officers, it's about the entire system." Alicia frowned. "But why now? Why tonight?" David's grip on the wheel tightened. "That's what bothers me. Hill didn't show up out of the goodness of his heart. There's more to this, Alicia. There always is." Alicia leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur as they sped past. "I just want to know why it always has to be us," she said quietly. "Why is it always people like me who have to prove we don't deserve to be treated like criminals?" "I didn't do anything wrong, David. I just wanted to come home." David glanced at her, his jaw clenching. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. What they did tonight, that's on them, not you." "But it doesn't feel that way," Alicia replied, her voice cracking. "It never does." David reached over and gave her hand a squeeze, his touch warm and steady. "I know," he said softly. "And that's why we can't let this slide. Not this time." They pulled into their driveway a few minutes later, the familiar sight of their home offering a small sense of comfort. But as Alicia stepped out of the car, she couldn't shake the lingering tension. Even the warm glow of the porch light didn't feel as inviting as it usually did. Inside, the house was quiet. Their two children were spending the night at Alicia's sister's place, and the silence only seemed to amplify the weight of the night's events. Alicia went straight to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water and taking a long sip. David leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but the look in her eyes said otherwise. "It's just everything. I keep thinking about how different tonight could have gone. What if you hadn't shown up when you did? What if—" "Don't," David interrupted gently, crossing the room to stand beside her. "Don't go down that road. You're safe. That's what matters." Alicia set her glass down, her hands trembling. "But for how long, David? What happens the next time? Because there will be a next time. There always is." David didn't have an answer, and that silence said more than words ever could. The next morning, David's phone buzzed before the sun was even up. He groaned, reaching for it on the nightstand. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but something told him it was important. "This is Johnson," he answered, his voice groggy. "Agent Johnson, this is Hill." David sat up instantly, his sleepiness evaporating. "Hill? What's going on?" "I thought you'd want to know," Hill said, his tone brisk. "Those officers? They're already trying to spin the narrative. Internal Affairs has been flooded with reports claiming they stopped your wife because of a suspicious vehicle matching a wanted description. Total garbage, obviously, but it's gaining traction." David swung his legs over the side of the bed, his jaw tightening. "So they're doubling down. Not surprising. It gets worse," Hill continued. "This department has a history of burying complaints like this. If we don't move fast, they're going to make this disappear." David pinched the bridge of his nose, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony. Details. Anything you've got that can help us build a solid case," Hill said. "But I need you to know, once we start this, there's no going back. This investigation is going to get ugly, and they're going to come for you. Your wife, too." David's grip on the phone tightened. "They can try. But I'm not backing down." Hill paused for a moment before replying. "Good. I'll be in touch." As the call ended, David set his phone down and stared out the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint golden light over the neighborhood. But instead of feeling hopeful, all he could think about was the battle ahead. When Alicia came downstairs a few minutes later, still in her pajamas, she found David sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open and a cup of coffee in his hand. "Already up?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. David nodded. Hill called. "The department's already trying to cover their tracks. He needs my help." Alicia sank into the chair across from him, her face pale. "And you're going to give it to him, aren't you?" David met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I have to. If we don't fight this, They'll just keep doing it, to us, to someone else. It doesn't stop unless we make it stop. Alicia didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. Just promise me one thing, she said softly. Anything, David replied. Promise me this fight won't destroy us. David squeezed her hand, his voice firm but gentle. I promise. But as they sat there in the quiet of their kitchen, both of them knew that some promises were easier made than kept. And the storm that was brewing? It was going to test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Because while the truth was on their side, they were about to learn just how powerful and dangerous the forces protecting the status quo could be. The storm came faster than either David or Alicia had anticipated. By the next week, the investigation was making headlines, and their names were at the center of it all. David had officially filed his statement with the DOJ, and as promised, Hill wasted no time launching a probe into the department. But the backlash was swift, and it was brutal. David had expected resistance. He knew the old boys club would fight tooth and nail to protect their own, but he hadn't fully prepared for how personal it would get. Anonymous calls to their home in the middle of the night. Threatening notes slipped under their front door. Even Alicia's workplace wasn't spared. She came home one evening shaking, after finding a slur scrawled across the windshield of her car in the office parking lot. They're trying to scare us, David said, his voice firm as he comforted Alicia. But they're not going to win. David, this isn't just about us anymore, Alicia replied, her voice trembling. What about the kids? What if they come after them? David's jaw tightened, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He'd been so focused on fighting the system, on exposing the truth, that he hadn't stopped to think about how much collateral damage might come with it. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Hill. Agent Johnson, we've got a problem, Hill said, skipping any pleasantries. What now? David asked, his patience wearing thin. The department's lawyers are pushing back hard. They're claiming your wife's stop was legitimate because there was a bulletin out for a car matching hers. They're trying to make her look suspicious. David's grip on the phone tightened. That's a lie, and you know it. I do, Hill replied. But lies don't matter if people believe them. And right now, they've got the media spinning this in their favor. David's stomach churned. He turned on the TV, flipping to the local news. Sure enough, there it was, a segment framing the officers as just doing their jobs and painting Alicia as uncooperative. This is how they work, Hill continued. They'll smear your name, discredit your wife, and make you out to be the villain. If we don't push back with something stronger, this investigation could stall before it even gets off the ground. David paced the living room, his mind racing. What do you need from me? I need you to go public, Hill said bluntly. Do an interview. Tell your side of the story before they can control the narrative. If people hear directly from you and Alicia, it'll be a lot harder for the department to sweep this under the rug. David glanced at Alicia, who was sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. The thought of dragging her further into the spotlight made his chest ache, but Hill was right. We'll do it, David said, his voice firm. Set it up. The next day, David and Alicia sat in front of bright studio lights, facing a journalist with a reputation for hard-hitting interviews. The questions came fast and sharp, but David and Alicia didn't waver. They told the truth, about the stop, the officer's behavior, and the harassment they'd faced since speaking out. I'm not doing this just for me, Alicia said, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. I'm doing this for every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. For every black woman who's been stopped and questioned just for existing. The interview aired that night, and it was explosive. Social media lit up with outrage, hashtags like #JusticeForAlicia trending nationwide. But with the support came a new wave of threats. Anonymous accounts flooded their inboxes with vile messages, and one night, David woke up to the sound of shattering glass. Someone had thrown a brick through their living room window. David rushed outside, his heart pounding, but whoever had done it was already gone. Alicia stood behind him, clutching her phone. David, we can't keep living like this, she said, tears streaming down her face. But as David stared at the broken glass, anger rose in his chest like a wildfire. He was done being afraid. The next morning, he called Hill. They're not going to scare us into silence, he said. What's our next move? Hill's voice was calm but determined. We've got enough to bring formal charges against those officers. And if the department tries to retaliate, We'll hit them with obstruction. But I need you and Alicia to stay safe. Things are going to get worse before they get better. And Hill wasn't wrong. The coming weeks were a whirlwind of lawsuits, protests, and endless media coverage. But slowly, cracks began to show in the department's armor. Other officers came forward with their own stories of misconduct, and the investigation uncovered damning evidence of racial profiling and corruption at every level. Finally, the day came when Graham and Mills were called to testify in court. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and under pressure, they crumbled. They admitted to targeting Alicia simply because of the color of her skin, and their confession sent shockwaves through the city. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, Alicia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a step forward. As they walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras, Alicia turned to David. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. David shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not over," he said. "But it's a start." And for the first time in weeks, Alicia felt a flicker of hope. Because while the fight for justice was far from finished, they'd proven that even in the face of fear and adversity, the truth had a way of coming out, and when it did, it could change everything.